Thank you very much for that kind and very full introduction. I want to thank the organizers for giving me the plenary keynote. This is the second time that I've been so privileged. The first occasion was in 2016 when I spoke about the pathology of Middle Eastern studies. And that's close enough in time so that some of you might remember some of the things I said. I had to reread my remarks to refresh my memory, since my memory isn't what it used to be. You know, that annoys me sometimes, but the rest of the time I forget about it. But in any event, I'm going to try not to repeat points that I made back in 2016, or at least I'll try to deploy some different evidence. Now, 43 years ago, in 1979, the journal The American Scholar ran an unusual article. Now, The American Scholar, just to remind you, is the quarterly literary magazine of the Phi Beta Kappa Society. It's a journal, that almost never publishes anything related to the Middle East. But the summer issue that year featured an article entitled "The State of Middle Eastern Studies," and its author was Bernard Lewis. Now, for those of you new to this association, the late Bernard Lewis, who died in 2018, was the co-founder of ASMEA with Fuad Ajami. The veterans among you will also recall that he attended and keynoted this conference. ASMEA also awards an annual research prize that bears his name, and that ceremony is going to take place this evening. Now, I've been asked by the conference organizers to address exactly the same topic that Lewis addressed in his article in 1979. So I thought it would be interesting to return to that article and review what Lewis thought needed emphasis. I mean, this isn't so much to understand him as it is to understand how the field has changed. Are the problems the same? Have they evolved for better or for worse? And what might lie in the future of our field? Now, the first thing that should be noted is chronology. Edward Said had published his book Orientalism in November of 1978. Lewis's article appeared after that in the summer of 1979. But I don't think Lewis was responding to Said in this piece. First, the American Scholar is a quarterly. Quarterlies have this long lead time into publication. So Lewis may have written his article before he saw the book. Second, even if Lewis had seen Orientalism, the book hadn't yet had any impact on Middle Eastern studies. That was still a few years off in the future. All of which is to say that Lewis's critique referred to Middle Eastern studies prior to the impact of Edward Said. And as we shall see, he later did register the effect of Orientalism on the field, but not in this first iteration. So let's begin with his first criticism. As was his wont, Lewis prefaced it with a quick history of the field as it developed in the West from the 16th century onwards. Lewis wasn't just a historian of the Middle East. He was a historian of its study in the West. And this introduction remains a tour de force. He then moves to the more recent expansion of Middle Eastern studies in the post-World War II era. The government and the foundations invested massively in area studies. A dozen or so Middle Eastern centers were created in the universities. Hundreds of appointments were made. Now, does Lewis celebrate this? Not at all. His verdict, and I quote him, "Given the amount of money and effort spent on the development of Middle Eastern studies in the English-speaking world, the results have been disappointing." End of quote. Now, not just disappointing. He goes on to describe what he calls, and I quote, "the relative failure of Middle Eastern studies in the universities." Right? Failure of Middle Eastern studies. Those are fighting words. I use them in the subtitle of my book, Ivory Towers on Stand, "The Failure of Middle Eastern Studies in America." So I know how incendiary those words are. But I was describing Middle Eastern studies post-Said. Lewis called them a failure 22 years before I did pre-Said. So why? First, Lewis finds the field afflicted by what he bluntly calls, and I quote him, ignorance, or to put it differently, a low level of professional competence, end of quote. So the field had expanded too fast with what he calls predictable consequences. He outlines those consequences in what must rank as one of the most devastating critiques of one's own field ever made by a scholar. And let me quote him in full. This is Lewis. "It is painful for a Middle East specialist to admit the fact, but it is nevertheless inescapable. Professional advancement in Middle Eastern studies can be achieved with knowledge and skills well below what is normally required in other more developed fields. This had led to low standards of entry at the student level that continue to the professorial level, to low standards of performance, and to low standards of promotion in academic institutions." End of quote. Now, he particularly laments that many in the field don't know a Middle Eastern language. Some universities, he says, sought to address this problem by importing scholars from the region itself. But here again, demand exceeded supply, resulting in what Lewis describes as appointments of dubious value. Unhappy appointments was another phrase he used. So let's revisit Lewis's point at a distance of 43 years. Could one make the same critique today? Are standards so abysmally low? Are languages so little known? It's not an easy question to answer, and it's one that I pose for our conversation. It also would be pointless to generalize about a field covering 15 centuries, dozens of contemporary states, and a geographic area from the Atlantic shores of North Africa to the Hindu Kush Mountains. My sense is that there is more sophisticated work being done in the field using an ever-widening range of sources in the languages of the region. Not long ago, my own alma mater, the Near Eastern Studies Department at Princeton, began posting web pages for each of its graduates, listing their books. And presumably every other PhD producing program in this country could do the same. Browsing Princeton's, I came away impressed, although I obviously can't vouch for the scholarly value of a very huge corpus which I haven't read, and indeed that no one could read in its entirety. So fine work is being done. And I would hesitate today to level a general charge of pervasive low standards, despite prominent examples of shoddy work and subjects that don't get covered. But I think there's a deeper concern. One of the great disappointments of Middle Eastern studies today is that they don't seem to produce scholars whose work is broadly appreciated within the academy itself. And I'm not talking here about public recognition of the kind that Bernard Lewis and Fuad Ajami had, because that's exceedingly rare. I'm speaking here of the general reader of the Chronicle of Higher Education. Among the founding fellows of the Middle East Studies Association, not our association but MESA, and we're talking about 1966, there were greats such as Richard Ettinghausen and Shlomo Dov Goitein and Oleg Grabar and Gustav von Grunebaum and Franz Rosenthal. And to them you could add Joseph Schacht and Sir Hamilton Gibb. And they'd been imported from Europe in the immediate post-war, and they commanded immense respect within the wider academy as scholars of formidable and vast learning. And that was because they knew not only the Middle East and Islam, but they possessed a total mastery of the legacy of the West. Lewis himself belongs in this category, and they were, here I'll borrow a phrase that was applied by Lewis to von Grunebaum, they were patriots of civilization. Now, where are their heirs? Where are the practitioners of Middle Eastern studies whose names might crop up in a general conversation in a more discerning faculty lounge? Whose contributions are so significant that they transcend the narrow confines of Middle Eastern studies? I think the list of contenders would be very short and probably not as impressive as the one I just gave you. If so, then it would still be the case that Middle Eastern studies lag behind many other nearby fields. And this isn't because the history and the culture and the politics of the Middle East are any less fertile a field for inspired genius. It's because genius tends to avoid them, for reasons I'll come to next. Lewis's second criticism is that the field had become an arena for what he called the working of emotion and prejudice by academics with political agendas. These people, he thinks, with their, and I quote him, political allegiances and interests, can seriously distort the life and growth of academic departments. Lewis goes on to assert that some institutions, and again I quote him, have become so politicized as to make life unpleasant for teachers or students who do not belong or will not submit to the dominant faction. And the result is what he calls, and I quote him one more time, subtle censorship, and worse still, self-censorship, which could ultimately be the destruction of the free spirit of inquiry, discovery, and expression. End of quote. Now, the fact that Lewis wrote this before the intrusion of Edward Said shows that Orientalism reinforced existing trends that had already started from within. In later years, Lewis grew much more pessimistic about the trajectory as the problem evidenced in a few institutions became endemic to the field as a whole. Many years later in his memoirs, he wrote that, and I quote him, the Saidians now control appointments, promotions, publications, and even book reviews. And then he drew this dramatic comparison. And I'll quote him again. He's very quotable. In Middle Eastern studies, it has become commonplace that certain lines of thought, if that is the right word, must be accepted and applied if one wishes to achieve appointment, promotion, and tenure. The kind of enforced orthodoxy can extend even to learned journals and publishing houses and has been used to bring about a level of intellectual conformism unknown for centuries. On another occasion, he spoke of a greater degree of imposed orthodoxy than in any other time since the Middle Ages. Right? In an address here in ASMEA, he bemoaned a degree of thought control, of limitations of freedom of expression without parallel in the Western world since the 18th century, and in some areas longer than that. Right? Now, that's saying rather a lot. Probably too much. No one's books are being burnt. But it might be more accurate if limited to the English-speaking part of the West. Lewis then lived to see his worst premonitions of 1979 come true. The belief that it's the moral duty of the academic to advocate and agitate anywhere and everywhere in the classroom, in the appointments committee, in the professional association, in the referee journal, in the book review. Right? That's a given in large parts of this field. Not only is perfect objectivity deemed unobtainable, which is true, right, but aiming even for imperfect objectivity is dismissed as a dereliction of the duty of the scholar, whose mission is to double as an activist and a militant. Just this year, this tendency achieved a new low when the membership of the Middle East Studies Association, MESA, passed a resolution calling for the academic boycott of Israeli universities. These, so it is claimed, are imbricated by their provision of direct assistance to the Israeli military and intelligence establishments. The vote was 768 to 167, which is a lopsided count reminiscent of referenda held in parts of the Middle East. No matter how you parse it, the effect of such resolutions is the intimidation of the few by the many. The sanctions are most threatening not to Israeli universities, but to American scholars and students who would join conferences and programs in Israel. Now, of course, it's ironic that an association for the study of the Middle East should boycott the freest universities in the Middle East. According to the Academic Freedom Index, which is put together by the Global Public Policy Institute and Scholars at Risk, Israel is the only country in the Middle East that earns an A for academic freedom. For comparison, Tunisia earns a B, Iraq, Kuwait, and Lebanon receive a C, while Jordan, Libya, and Sudan earn a D. Most of the other countries in the Middle East get an E, including Bahrain, Egypt, Iran, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, Yemen, and Syria. Israel's score by this index is even higher than that of the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and Australia. So if MESA really cared about academic freedom in the Middle East, it would hold up Israeli universities as models to the region. Instead, these are the only universities MESA thinks deserve to be boycotted. Now, of course, the boycott is not academic. It's political. Something that would have been unthinkable to the founders of MESA. They were meticulous about keeping the association above politics. They knew full well that politics could only divide them against themselves and from the public. You could say what you wanted at MESA, but you didn't try to drag MESA itself to endorse your cause. Over the years, a few of the presidents of MESA continued to warn against going down this rabbit hole. Maybe the last to do was Fred Donner, well-regarded medievalist at the University of Chicago. In his 2012 MESA presidential address, he spoke against the U.S. ever going to war against Iran. But he added this, and I quote him, "Our organization is open to all scholars, both those who may support such a war and those who oppose it. Indeed, MESA must continue to remain open to all points of view if it is to sustain meaningful dialogue. It is essential that MESA eschew taking an official position as an organization on any issue, even though every one of us individually will likely hold strong opinions on them one way or another." End of quote. President of MESA, 2012. In 2015, the BDS mobilization at MESA gained momentum. Some of you were there. Professor Donner had personally signed on to the academic boycott the previous year. But he still insisted that MESA stand above it. If it didn't, MESA would lose good members. He said it might come under pressure to take other political positions and perhaps would get tangled in lawsuits. But Donner's most telling argument was this, and I quote him, "MESA's endorsement of BDS will hand MESA's enemies, who have persistently but until now wrongly claimed that MESA has been politicized, exactly the evidence they need to make their case against us, which they will not hesitate to do." Right? So indeed, I won't hesitate. I hope Professor Donner would now agree that MESA, by his own measure, has been politicized, having passed the very resolution that he opposed. MESA has opted out of fostering any meaningful dialogue related to Israel. Now, MESA transitioned from scholarship to this brand of political advocacy because determined militants infiltrated its ranks with the express purpose of using its prestige to advance their partisan political agenda. Serious scholars, like Donner, were given the end run by these opportunists, and the one who engineered this at MESA was a human rights attorney whose resume I'll spare you, but who defines herself as a grassroots organizer. So thus has the great MESA fallen. And in its fall, it exemplifies the downward spiral of Middle Eastern studies into intimidation and discrimination on the basis of political differences. The veil has been lifted. I mean, nobody knows how MESA's BDS resolution will be implemented in practice, but don't be surprised to see faculty bring their biases even more into the open, sanctioned as they are by an official resolution or by their professional peers. MESA is already rallying to them whenever they do, with barrages of threatening letters from their Committee on Academic Freedom. Now, you might think that there are some areas of Middle Eastern studies which are exempt. I mentioned that Fred Donner is a medievalist. Well, surely the study of medieval Islam is sufficiently remote from the passions of the present. Well, think again. Consider, for example, an organization called Middle East Medievalists, which describes itself as an association of scholars interested in the study of the medieval Middle East. And this is defined chronologically as the period between 500 and 1500 of the Common Era. Our Professor Donner was once president of that association, and he edited his prestigious journal for 20 years, I should add that he no longer seems to have a role there. In May 2021, the board of directors of this association of scholars issued a statement on Palestine. The directors condemned, quote, the unequal legal treatment of Palestinians in Israel and in the Palestinian territories, the ethnic cleansing of Palestinian neighborhoods, towns, and villages, and the subjugation of Palestinians within systems of apartheid, end of quote. Now, why would an association of medievalists with a cutoff date of 1500 take a stand on any current issue? The answer, I submit, is to be found in the paragraph that followed this ritual denunciation, and it isn't about Israel at all. And I quote it, listen carefully. The study of the medieval Middle East is complicit in the formation of Western ideas of inferiority and difference that have long underpinned the logic of settler colonialism. The racial and ethnic composition of academic departments of Middle Eastern studies, the boards of our journals and our professional associations contributes to ongoing regimes of scholarship that perpetuate otherness, end of quote. Now, rarely have I encountered such a blatant statement of the bigotry at the heart of it all. This nicely confirms what we already knew. Out in the field, Said's Orientalism is deployed to delegitimate scholars of certain races and ethnicities and replace them with others. Achievement counts for nothing if you're from a racial or ethnic group that's by definition complicit, right? You're part of the settler colonialist logic, occupying and exploiting our history. All this is directly traceable to Said's famous verdict in Orientalism. Maybe some of you remember it, I'll quote it. He wrote, "For a European or American studying the Orient, there can be no disclaiming the main circumstances of his actuality, that he comes up against the Orient as a European or American first, and as an individual second." The statement still shocks. It's a reworking of the idea of original sin, now attached to ethnic or racial identity at birth. As Edward Said was also an American from birth, one wonders whether he should be regarded as an American first and as an individual second. No doubt he exempted himself from his own rule of thumb here. And here I feel some sympathy for the Fred Donners of the world. Donner, and I take him just as an example, he marched in Washington against the war in Iraq. He opposes a war against Iran. He signed a BDS resolution. His book, Muhammad and the Believers, argues that Islam at its inception was an ecumenical movement. As an individual, Donner did all the right things when he came up against the Orient. What could he not do? Change his racial and ethnic composition, which makes a scholar complicit, regardless of his personal politics or his sympathetic scholarship. And if any more justification were needed, Donner had the temerity to argue that his scholarly association shouldn't take a political stand on the one true cause, which is BDS, complicit as charged. Radicals, modernists and medievalists alike, want to rid the faculty and the boards and associations and journals precisely of individuals who still cling to liberal values. And to do so, they denounce merit-based achievement as regimes of scholarship. Did you ever hear that phrase before? Regimes of scholarship. And they openly advocate regime change. It's right out of Orwell. Not 1984, but Animal Farm. So the fever has spread even to the most remote corners of the field. Now, I imagine that there are hundreds of people in Mesa, including not a few medievalists, who recoil at this sort of politicization and think it's a bigoted travesty. But I only imagine it because they haven't spoken up. Where are the scholars with the courage of their convictions? The majority of Mesa's members didn't vote in the BDS referendum. So do they think that that's sufficient? Do they believe that such self-imposed silence, it's a counterweight to the BDS vote? As Yeats put it, the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. That's why the Center of Middle Eastern Studies hasn't held. And I fault not the militants, but those others who failed to stand their ground. Lewis's last warning from 1979 is about the corrupting effects of funding by foreign governments. This was just beginning in the 1970s, following the oil embargo of 1973. The Arab states thought to turn Middle Eastern studies into their amen corner by handing out cash at a time of diminished support by the federal government and the foundations. And this foreign funding grew substantially in the 1980s, 1990s, and some centers became addicted to it. But no one knew its scale. While federal and some state laws require the disclosure of such gifts, there isn't a penalty for failing to disclose. And until recently, there was no effort at enforcement. So who got the money? Well, Arab governments, or people fronting for Arab governments, were very strategic about their giving. They had no particular allegiance to schools that they hadn't attended anyway, and they weren't overawed by vines of ivory or neo-Gothic courtyards. They rewarded academics with proven track records of doing what they, the donors, wanted. And since the donors might donate again, the recipients gave them what they paid for. Now, this was a dirty little secret that Mesa worked hard to conceal. From time to time, its committees would warn against the corrupting effects of American government money if it came from defense or intelligence agencies. But I've never seen a comparable demand for transparency about foreign government funding. And as a result, the revelations have been haphazard. The most interesting ones followed a campaign by Trump's Department of Education to hold universities' feet to the fire. This had more to do with Chinese funding than Middle Eastern money. But there were plenty of Middle East disclosures, too. My favorite Trump-era revelation dates from 2020, the disclosure that the University of Pennsylvania had contracts with the Saudi Ministry of Defense over several years for $2 million, apparently to bring Saudi officers to hear lectures on the Penn campus. Now, this irony, my friends, is splendid. The current president of Mesa is from Penn. She heads an association that boycotts Israeli universities for being imbricated in Israeli state acts. Yet her own university takes money to train a defense establishment that's killed thousands of civilians in Yemen. Of course, don't wait for Mesa to hold Penn to account or propose that it be boycotted. The long-standing understanding in Mesa is that this dirty laundry shouldn't be aired in public, and actually I doubt it's even aired in private. So foreign funding is there, but what's been its effect? It's not self-evident. On the one hand, it seems to have created black holes of forbidden subjects. They're forbidden lest their pursuit precludes some handsome gift from this or that Middle Eastern prince. But while the foreign funding probably amplifies the problems in the field, it is not their cause. There's a new report, maybe some of you saw it, by the National Association of Scholars devoted to Middle East centers. It found no difference between the politicization of centers that received foreign funds and those that didn't. Right? They're all politicized to the same degree. So the idea that Middle Eastern studies would have somehow evolved differently without Middle Eastern money seems to me somewhat naive. But exposing that funding serves, I think, a salubrious purpose. In 1979, Lewis complained about low professional standards. I think that's changed, and that standards have risen. The problem of Middle Eastern studies today isn't low standards, it's double standards. The field is rife with them, and it's nowhere more easily documented than in the refusal to reveal and discuss and to debate foreign funding, which is support by governments that consistently get an E in academic freedom at home. I return to Lewis. Despite his critique, and remember, we have low standards, rampant politicization, corruption, Lewis ended his 1979 piece on an optimistic note. He praised what he called a new generation of graduate students and young scholars who are committed to scholarship. And he said, good students would somehow find their way to good teachers and in time do good work. I think that did happen here and there. Of course, many of them couldn't find good jobs, which is the point of it all. And indeed, one wonders whether someone with Lewis's astonishing range of talents could find a position in America today. And that's a sobering thought. And this would have been a rather sad story, I think, of dashed expectations, were it not for Lewis's last act, the founding of this association. Lewis and ASMEA's co-founder, Fuad Ajami, didn't go down cursing the darkness. Lewis gave us his vision of ASMEA's role when he founded it, and I want to revisit it now because it can and should still guide us. But first, why did he do ASMEA? Lewis came to America from Britain too late to found his own Middle East program or to build out an existing one. When he arrived here in 1975, he was just shy of 60 years old. In those days, Princeton still mandated retirement at 70. So he only spent about 10 years teaching there. He had some students, I was one of them, but the time was short and the numbers were small. For his first 4 years after retirement, he tried to set up an institute for advanced study of the Middle East in Philadelphia. He described that effort in his memoirs as a total failure and a personal tragedy. ASMEA filled that empty space, an institution which would sustain his vision of what Middle Eastern studies should be. Its purpose was clear to him. ASMEA, he wrote in his memoirs, was established, and I quote him, to counter the straitjackets of Mesa and to provide a platform and a medium for ideas and opinions that deviate from currently enforced orthodoxy, end of quote. Now, the fact that ASMEA is still here, 15 years after its founding conference, validates his belief that there are scholars, and you are here, who want freedom from imposed orthodoxies, who seek unfettered debate, and who need a truly neutral platform free from political intimidation by activists and militants. If Mesa had sustained the spirit of its founders, there wouldn't have been a need for ASMEA. But with each passing year, Masons have tightened the cords on their own straitjackets. This past spring, Mesa was finally overrun by boycotters who would subject the freest universities in the Middle East to a ban. Later this month, beginning of next month, Mesa will meet in Denver. It might as well meet in Damascus. It's become a place not where the Middle East is studied, but where the worst of it is replicated. Now, Lewis in his memoirs left us one more guideline, which he called profoundly important. ASMEA, he wrote, would counter Mesa, and I quote him, without establishing a similarly repressive alternative. The battle is now engaged, not between rival ideologies, but between enforced ideology and freedom. Enforced ideology and freedom. Which is to say that ASMEA, though it was conceived in response to Mesa, isn't the anti-Mesa. It isn't pro this cause, while Mesa is pro that cause. ASMEA instead is the true heir to the liberal mission for Middle Eastern studies, first defined by the founders of Mesa, a mission cast overboard by their radicalized successors. And this leaves ASMEA the only scholarly association for the study of the Middle East in America. What's called Mesa has become a political advocacy group. And by the way, if you have a look at their strategic plan for the next 5 years, it speaks of a dual commitment to scholarship and advocacy. Now, this may seem to you a brash assertion on my part, but if we remain as steadfast in the defense of our academic freedom as they have been in its suppression, that assertion will come to be acknowledged as fact in the fullness of time. And each one of you is part of this story of renewal. May we all rise to the task we've assigned ourselves to preserve and to restore our freedoms. Thank you very much.